mine called me and said that Justin had overdosed on some pills. And so I immediately got off the phone with her, and I called his stepfather, or his dad, the guy who raised him, basically. And I talked to him, and I said, well, I'm headed to work, so if you need me, call me. And we had in this manufacturing factory, we had a very strict no cell phones on the floor policy. And I didn't intend to have my phone in my pocket. That wasn't my desire. I didn't set out to be disrespectful to the rules, but I did have my phone in my pocket. Because when it vibrated at 4 o'clock in the morning, I was like, hey, my phone's in my pocket. And I pulled it out, and it was his grandmother. And I didn't answer it because I'm on the floor, and I didn't want to lose my job. And so I kind of made my way toward the bathroom, or to the break room, so that I could, check the voicemail. And then before I got there, my pastor called me. And then so right there on the floor, I just answered the phone. And he told me that Justin had committed suicide. So I immediately walked up to my department supervisor, who is a pastor himself.
Oh, wow.
And said, hey, I have to go. I'm leaving. I'll take a point, and whatever it takes. I'll take whatever punishment, but I have to go, and here's why. And it was a Friday. So I immediately drove to the house and told my wife. And then I got changed, and I went to my high school, which was his high school, where I graduated as well. And I walked in, and I just walked in the office, and the ladies that were there were the ladies that were there when I was in high school, and I told them who I was and that I was Justin's youth pastor, and I didn't even need a badge or nothing. They just let me go. And so I went around trying to find all my youth, and because nobody really found out until he got to school. And so, which is crazy, because a few years, when I was in high school, we'd had a kid pass away from cancer, named Josh English, who was a good friend of mine. And I remember walking up to the second floor of the school, and in 97, and when I walked around that corner, I saw all the kids crying, and that's how I knew that Josh had passed away. And then I walk up the same flight of stairs, 13 years later, and there's kids crying because of what had happened. And it was very emotional. That's when I kind of started having to hold stuff back. And because I got to address the faculty, which was kind of cool, but I told them that today is our day to help these children, and we need to be there for them. These teenagers we're struggling, we're hurting, but we can wait until we get home to break down. We need to be here for these children right now. And I just ask everybody, because there's always a strong one. When somebody dies, there's always a strong family member. And I just requested all of them to be the strong one. Be strong for those kids until you get home. When you get home, do what you got to do, get in your car or whatever. But be the strong one right now. And so it was really interesting to be able to be a part of that, walking around the school and helping. Go ahead.
I don't think you did it wrong. I think you handled it very well by staying firm. I won't use the word firm, but you didn't. Yeah, you wasn't a basket case. You know what I mean? Like
no.
They needed someone that had it together at that time to kind of help them cope with it. So I don't think you did it wrong. I think it was just a different approach.
Oh, well, that's just, the Lord was with me there. There's no way around that one. There's no way to explain it other than God was just giving me strength when I needed it the most. But it was a couple days, that afternoon we went to his mom's house and his house and hung out with the family. And then, it was just, we were still questioning what caused this, what was, and it's taken us years to kind of look back at it and figure out, is there something we could have done? Is there something we couldn't have done? Did we do enough? And I think what's important is for the ministers to, if you have youth, or even if it's not even youth, even if it's not your ministry, if it's your family, if there's a suicide that happens, and unfortunately it happens, and we deplore it, we hate it, but unfortunately it happens. Especially on the ministry side, it is our job as ministers to continue to be the minister. Mm-hmm. We have to be the minister. There can be no difference in how we minister between a woman who has fought cancer for 5 years and finally dies. As tough as that is, we've been prepared for it. If someone just out of nowhere dies in a car accident, so we weren't prepared for it, but it happens, and we don't get as upset about it because it wasn't suicide. But one of the things that I noticed that through that was how even the pastoral staff at our church, none of us had ever dealt with that. It was something that no one had ever dealt with, a suicide in the church, let alone a teenager.
Right.
And we did, I think, the best that we could have done. And we really opened up the doors. The funeral was on a Monday, and the church only holds about 250 people, but there was probably 400 people in that church, and over 70% of them were teenagers. And we had the family in the very front, and the front 2 rows was family, and everybody right behind them was teenagers. We let the teenagers have the front. And it was a funeral. It was difficult, but apparently, I know of 7 kids that gave their life to the Lord at the funeral, and they became members of our youth group. But there was reports of 50 that did that, but then went on to other churches. So the Lord still used it for His greater good and His glory. But it's just kind of unfortunate that it went the way it did for us. We're the ones that felt that loss more than a lot of other people. But yeah, it was definitely challenging.
I bet. I mean, I remember I think I was in 10th grade when, and my friend, she didn't commit suicide, but I had talked to her about, we were in band together, or she was on the color guard, I was in band. We were talking about the show, because every time she would wave her flag, she'd hit me upside the head with the pole or whatever. So I'm picking with her, and her name was Rachel, and I forget what her last name was, Chasson. But she called herself Dork, and she looked gothic, she dressed gothic, but nobody never knew what Dork meant until she died. And Dork actually meant daughter of a righteous king. But anyway, we were laughing about the whole, stop hitting me upside the head with the pole, this, that, and the other. Well, 2 minutes later, as I got into the class, I hear a bunch of commotion, and she literally dropped dead of an aneurysm in my other friend's arms. And the whole school was just taken by surprise when that happened, because that was the first death, our class ever dealt with. And then a couple months later, another classmate passed away. And then a few years later, another classmate passed away. So, that hit us hard, but it wasn't like, it wasn't as bad as when my buddy Brody committed suicide when he was running from the cops. That one took us all by surprise. But yeah, suicide is one of those things where you can either handle it or you can't. And let's be real, nobody can handle suicide. So with that being said, how did you help your youth cope with the pain?
Well, so my philosophy with the suicide prevention is the same philosophy I have for bullying and anti-bullying, which is next month.
Yeah.
It's God, Jehovah Father, right? He said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. And because we know that God is all present, all knowing, and He knows what's going to happen before it happens. That one thing that I did this sermon one time talking to, I don't remember if it was teenagers or if it was to the adults. I don't recall at the moment, but I used the analogy of an autographed baseball, and so the autographed baseball being let's think of somebody like Babe Ruth. Okay, so Babe Ruth signs a baseball. It's just a baseball, and it's just got a man's signature on it, but it's Babe Ruth. You just think, oh, it's Babe Ruth. How much is that baseball worth? Well, the way that you quantify what something is worth, it's based on what someone is willing to give for it. So for you, if it's, I'll give $10 for it and that's it, then it's worth $10 to you. But if somebody's willing to give $1 million for it, then that baseball is technically worth $1 million, even though to you it's only worth 10.
Right.
And if somebody's willing to give $100 million for an autographed Babe Ruth baseball, then that baseball becomes worth $100 million. even though you're only willing to give 10 for it. And so, yeah, sorry, if I had to catch myself before I get crazy on this, but what I did was I pointed out that your worth isn't based on what you think it is. It isn't based on what your parents think it is. It isn't based on what your friends think it is. It isn't based on what Uncle Sam thinks it is. Your worth is based on the fact that God was willing to give his son up for that, which makes your self-worth insanely valuable. Or it makes your worth insanely valuable. Even if your self-worth isn't valuable, a high number, God's worth to you is a really high number. And so when you talk about bullying and you talk about suicide, because they kind of go together a lot, the same principle, is you just have to explain to people what their worth is. And your worth is so high that God himself took on flesh and died for you so that you wouldn't have to go to hell.
Right.
That's a very valuable high number. You know, you can't even, that is the true priceless number. You cannot put a number on that. And so that's something that the Lord gave me at 2:00 in the morning one night when I was working in the factory. I just felt that in my spirit. And I laughed. I remember laughing about it. And I had this one kid that was working with me alongside his dad was a pastor at a local church. And I told him what it was. He goes, "Oh, that's pretty cool. I like that." And then so I just kind of worked it up and prayed and said, "Lord, how do I teach this?" And I got to teach it. And I've used it a lot because that's what it is. I think for me, that was my tool. How do you do that? Well, you know how you might not feel you're worth anything, but you are. You know, and you might not feel like you're loved, but all you have to do is go to a funeral of a kid who commits suicide and realize how much they were loved. And, you know, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, a thief comes but to steal, kill, and destroy. No, I'm sorry. That's John 10:10. I'm all over the place. No, 10:13 says God won't put nothing on you that you can't handle. That's what it is. I'm sorry. I'm just a little nervous. But it says that there's nothing come to you that's not common to man. You're not the only one that's dealing with this. You're not the only one. And if it wasn't, you know, and if it wasn't your friends or something, then there are other people. You're not by yourself. But you feel by yourself. You feel alone. You feel depressed. You feel like that it would be better if they were gone. And we can look back and say, no, there's no way that's the case. But man, at that moment, who knows what was going through his mind?
Right.
And I pray that we get to people in advance to tell them, hey, listen, it doesn't matter what those people did. It doesn't matter what those people didn't do and how they affected you positively or negatively. What matters is that what matters is that you understand where you stand with the Father. And that's what matters.
Right.
And that was my way.
Yeah. And people need to, I'm going to say harsh, but people should know their worth through Christ. You know, I mean, he came and died for us. It's not like we're chopped liver just going to be thrown on the side of the road for every dog to eat. You know, we have a purpose in this world, you know.
Absolutely. And it's sad, though, because you're trying to teach this to Christians. And that's something they should already know. You know, it's something and maybe not in the suicide argument of it, but or side of the discussion. It's there's a lot of Christians who develop a relationship with Jesus, but they just barely do it. They don't really understand their worth in Christ.
Right.
And that's why I think it's that is my weapon. That is my tool. And I know there's other tools out there, and if they work, then let's do it. You know, but that's how I dealt with it at that time, and that's how I had to deal with it with myself.
Yeah.
You know, I had to question myself a lot through that. So.
Yeah. Now, what advice or guidance would you give to your youth group or any youth for that matter about suicide, and how would you give them hope in Christ? So it's a two-part question.
Yeah. What was the first part again? I want to answer separately.
The first part was, what advice or guidance would you give to our youth about suicide?
Well, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And it's not, when people say a lot of people will say that people after committing suicide are self